Okay, we're back. We've already talked about one of the constitutional problems that's involved with Donald Trump trying to punish Twitter, trying to take over an independent agency and the FCC, trying to interpret the law in a way that is at odds with the interpretation given to Section 230 in federal courts. So now we're going to move on to yet another constitutional problem. How many are there? I mean, let us count the ways.
Too many to count. I can't count that high.
You know, a lot of people are focusing on the application of Section 230, which we discussed in the last video, but there's a constitutional problem here as well, and that is governmental interference with a social media platform like Twitter obviously raises First Amendment concerns. And from the reporting, it looks like what Donald Trump wants to do here, or whoever in his administration is smart enough to set this up, which I think is probably coming from a layer or two down from the top guy. Somebody who understands all this is trying to.
Donald Trump can't spell FCC, so it's somebody else. It's a minion somewhere.
Yeah, somebody is orchestrating this, and what they want is to have federal agencies, including the FCC, keeping an eye on social media platforms, obviously Twitter, Facebook, others, Twitter being Donald Trump's primary target du jour, to check for a political bias or, this is in the reporting, anti-conservative bias, which would probably mean pro-fact bias on the part of social media platforms, because God forbid we have those. God forbid we have actual, observable, empirically provable facts to base policy on or to base our opinions on. So they're going to be checking for that well-known liberal bias. And let's talk what's wrong with that. What's wrong with the government? And what's wrong with the White House instructing the FCC to be on the lookout, to be targeting political bias, and in particular, anti-conservative bias?
Sure. And let's start at the beginning with this because it's something that we've talked about in the past. This is clearly an instance of what we would call state or government action here. This is the president, the executive branch, acting to regulate speech and expressive activities of private speakers. Although they are big, humongous, multinational conglomerates, Facebook and Twitter and Google and all the other ISPs are private actors. So this is clearly the government trying to regulate speech and expressive activities. We talked about this before, right? The sort of constitutional fault line when it comes to regulating speech is what we call content-based regulation. Again, based on our understanding, Donald Trump is directing the FCC to monitor and regulate anti-conservative bias and or anti-political bias. Those are textbook examples of what, Professor Beery?
We call this content-based regulations.
There you go. Absolutely. And
viewpoint-based.
Yes, exactly. This is regulating, arguably, in the world of content, we kind of divide it up into a couple of broad categories. We divide it up into subjects and we divide it up into viewpoints. This arguably goes after both subjects and viewpoints.
Right, because about politics, right? So talking about politics as a subject matter, right? To regulate political speech as a subject matter restriction, to go further than that and take sides. So for example, don't demonstrate about the war, whatever war, would be a subject matter restriction. Don't demonstrate against the war would be a viewpoint-based restriction. And so here it looks like we have both. We don't want bias about politics, but in particular, we're looking for anti-conservative bias. You know, the kind of bias where people actually think that we have these things called thermometers that can measure temperatures. That kind of bias where you know these scientists who think that the globe is warming up, that kind of bias. Yeah, so that's particularly what we're after. So that's viewpoint based. And as we both know, it's one thing for a court to say this is a content based restriction. Then they're going to apply what you're going to describe here in a minute, strict scrutiny, even if it's content based. In my reading, if a court says this is a viewpoint based restriction, that's usually the end of the case. There's nowhere to go from there.
That is a huge mountain to climb, and I mean a huge mountain to climb. In either event, we're talking about what we call strict scrutiny, and we've been down this road before, right? If we venture into the realm of strict scrutiny, then it is the government's burden to demonstrate two things. Number one, that there is a compelling government interest in regulating, and number two, that the regulation itself is necessary and narrowly tailored, meaning there is no less restrictive way that we can regulate and achieve this compelling government interest. That is a huge burden for the government to clear, and in this case, quite frankly, and you and I talked about this before we started recording, I think any judge who isn't a complete hack and totally in the tank for Donald Trump spends something on the order of about a nanosecond concluding that the government fails on both compelling interest and narrow tailoring here.
Well, you're certainly not suggesting that Donald Trump's hurt feelings is something short of a compelling governmental interest, right?
Well, look, this is something that we didn't mention before, but look, this is functionally the equivalent, isn't it, of Donald Trump standing on the front steps of the White House and saying, I am the state. I am the law. Or more to the point, I am above the law. I get to decide what the law means and what the law says and what the law does and how the law is enforced. And as you aptly point out, what that means is that when Donald Trump gets his little 9-year-old schoolyard bully feelings hurt, that's going to create problems, right?
Or for those who speak French, l'état, c'est moi.
There you go. I am not quite that fluent, but that's exactly what I was trying to get at. I am the state.
Right.
That's Donald Trump's message here. Make no mistake about it, folks. Clearly and unequivocally, he believes that he is the state and he is the law.
That's the perfect note to end on, I think, with a little bit of French thrown in. So we've got two problems covered now, separation of powers, and we have a First Amendment problem with content and viewpoint-based proposed regulations, if this executive order is what we think it is. So we're going to do a couple more videos in this series. The next one is going to be it really dovetails off your point about state action. There's also the allegation flying around that Twitter, by tagging Donald Trump's, or a couple of Donald Trump's tweets with fact checks, that Twitter is somehow interfering with Donald Trump's First Amendment right to free speech. So we'll take that up in the next video.